Hello everyone, my name is Darla Saunders, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation and the Canadian Rivers Institute, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. The series is made possible in part thanks to the contributions of the Government of Canada. Today we're extremely happy to be hosting Terry Melanson. Terry is currently the Coordinator of Client Liaison and Partnerships with DFO and is based out of the Moncton office. He is a University of Moncton graduate with a master's degree in biology specializing in fish habitat. Before joining DFO, Terry worked for environmental groups as a fish habitat biologist, as a water quality expert with the New Brunswick Department of the Environment, and as a private environmental consultant. A large part of his expertise is related to fish habitat protection and restoration, fish population studies, and water quality. In his current position, Terry provides advice to partnering government agencies, environmental groups, and the private sector. He assists with the planning of projects that protect and restore fish habitat and promotes environmental stewardship at the watershed level. Lastly, he works closely with industry to develop beneficial management practices and codes of practice. Terry is also one of our near webinar professionals, and he's given several past presentations in the series that we host here. So before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping matters. For those of you who are new to the series, we'll save questions until the end of the presentation. The question and answer period will be bilingual, so feel free to ask questions in English or in French. To ask a question, you can use the webinar control panel, which is the little gray box that you should be seeing in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If the box is minimized, you can hit the orange arrow to enlarge it. And if you are using the audio of your computer, you can raise your hand, which is the yellow hand icon with the green arrow, and I can unmute you so that you can ask your question to Terry directly. You also have the option of typing in your question in the control panel, and I'll read it aloud for you during the question and answer session. So now I'm going to turn things over to Terry.
Well, thank you, Darla. Much appreciated. Yes, so I welcome everyone. I think maybe some of you have heard me in the past. I did present this same presentation in French, but I guess if I understand well, Darla, that there was such a demand that for it to be in English that we decided to give another session in English.
Yeah,
so,
you're back by popular demand.
Anyways, back by popular demand. Wow. Do I feel special today? Oh, sorry, I should back up. Anyway, so yeah, as you can see from the title of my presentation, it's all about fish habitat restoration. I hope you can learn a few tricks along the way here. And if not, if there's are some questions later on after the presentation, well, I can always be reached. You'll get my coordinates, and we can always discuss further down the road. So anyways, if we start off, a lot of the content of this presentation will be based on our publication that came out in 2006, which is entitled Ecological Restoration of Degraded Aquatic Habitats, a Watershed Approach. Now, that was a publication by DFO in the Gulf region. And it was developed by a team of biologists and also a consultant who had lots of experience in habitat restoration. Now, in a nutshell, I'll just go briefly or explain to you briefly what's in that book, but without going into details. Really, we're going to focus on part 4, which are the in-stream techniques. But if you look at the rest of the book, it talks a bit about stewardship, taking care of your environment, your watersheds. It defines what is ecological restoration. Then in the second part, we talk about the physical, chemical, and the biological processes that happen within a watershed. We go on to talk about human impacts and how we go about to mitigate those human impacts. In the third part, we talk about planning a project. How do you typically go about a project? That includes getting the proper permits and whatnot. So anyways, and of course the last part being in-stream techniques, which is the focus of today's presentation. Now, all that to say, we added a little a drawing here to show really how our thought process is, I guess, how we go about thinking this out. Of course, when we don't have any impacts, that's okay. That's what we would like to see. But in the real world, we do have various issues we deal with. So when we have degraded habitat, what do we typically see out there if we were to assess a watershed? Well, then you'd have one that could be fragmented. In other words, there are crossings, and wherever a road or infrastructure intersects a watercourse is usually, if it's properly done, there shouldn't be any fish passage issues. But in some cases, we do have issues with fish passage. So that's what we call a fragmented habitat, and those could be caused by culverts, dams, and whatnot, causeways. Then we may have some other land use issues, which are point source. In this case, could be erosion from a field somewhere, or runoff. Then we can have more non-source, so the ones we can't really tell where they're coming from, but you could sort of surmise that they come from a certain area. Once again, erosion and runoff can be troublesome. Then when you look into riparian zones, the zones adjacent to your watercourses, whether there's vegetation or absence of vegetation, or how much is left over, the type of vegetation and it will determine the stability of your riparian zones and the shade or organic input. But if you look at if you work to address all of these issues I just listed there, and there still are problems in a stream, that's when you resort to physical habitat restoration. So this is what this presentation is all about. So, in a nutshell, when you look at, we know watercourses come to form a certain way in our watersheds, and in our region, typically, we'll see a watercourse that sort of has like an S shape to it. So you'll have formations of pools in your bends, and then you'll have riffles, which are where the water's broken up and more shallow, and you'll have an alternation of these two main habitats. Of course, there are several other habitat types, but those are the main ones. And if you go further, for people who study geomorphology, they'll actually tell you that there's various shapes of watercourses, and we even assign them a letter. As in the U.S., we have David Roskin, who's well known out there, and he's got a classification, and that goes with various shapes of streams. If you look at the bottom here, the one we typically have in most cases in our region will be mostly like a C type, which has a gradient of less than 2%. So for those interested in geomorphology, that's just a quick fact there. So, all right. All right. Okay. Well, if we put that aside now, we look at really in the stream, because we're interested in habitat here. So if we look at a stream segment, let's say if you were to fly over part of a watershed, and then you were to fly closer, and you look at the segment, then you go into your reach, and then you go really into your pools and riffles. And then you go, let's say if you're able to go underneath the water, then you look at the various aspects of the fish habitat. You may find gravel, you may find moss that grows on boulders. The gravel may align itself to give you these transverse bars. I mean, you'll have variations of cobble, sand, silt. You may have leaf and other organic material in there. And that's all that whole diversity that makes up your fish habitat. And of course, there's other organisms in there. If you look at the microorganisms like invertebrates, some which their job is to break up the organic material. We call them shredders. And of course, as the organic material gets broken down, then you have some others scraping, this film off of degrading organic material, which we call scrapers. And you have all the other organisms which come into play in the food web and come to end up being food for these fish. So it's interesting how the complexity, ends up, given these nice fish that we prize so much, I guess, when we go fishing, which I like to fish as well. Okay, so let's set that aside. Now, one concept here, which I remember in university was that caught my interest, was called the river continuum concept. And not only do we have streams and rivers, but as we go at the top of watershed and we work our way down, we'll notice that some things tend to change gradually. It's all relative, but mind you, like the proportions of the types of invertebrates you'll find at the bottom of the river will tend to change as you go down. As the canopy will open up, so when you're in the smaller streams, you'll notice that the trees tend to crowd over and there'll be less light coming in. But to kickstart the primary productivity, you'll have more leaf material and organic matter falling into the streams. So it would make sense that you have more of these shredder-type invertebrates picking up that organic material, right? And as the canopy opens up, as you move down the watershed, then you get more light input. It would only make sense then, you'd have more algae and that type as you move down. So all that to say, this was a concept that was presented and generally well accepted. Now, when we run into problems, those are all nice, when you have an ecosystem in balance and everything seems to be working right, that's okay. But if you were to walk, you don't have to walk very far in many of our watersheds before running into problems. And that's why the focus here was to talk about Chapter 4 in our publication, which is basically the in-stream techniques. And these fall into broad categories, one being in-stream cover, bank stabilization, the formation of pool riffles and channel narrowing, especially where you have streams that are over-widened. And last of all, the removal of obstructions and debris. Now, if I get a little history, some people may have seen my older presentations, but I tend to use some ideas from. Anyways, if we look back at restoration, we know back in the early days maybe they didn't think so much about it, but here's something out of I guess an old publication back in 1947 where they actually, you could see from here that they were actually thinking about conservation back then. So, so yeah, we've been thinking about it for a long time. And some had good intentions to stabilize banks, but here would be an example of what not to do. I don't think you should go out to the junkyard and grab a bunch of cars and use them for riverbank stabilization, but nonetheless, you can see that they were already thinking of doing some good back then. Now here's something more recent, something I saw myself as I was out with the watershed group a few years ago. A gentleman brought me to the site and he was very proud of it, and he said, well, look at this, some restoration was done here. And I looked at the lobster traps and said, well, yeah, maybe they're not causing any harm, but they're certainly not doing any good either. So they were supposed to capture silt, but anyways, the traps were removed and they did something else with them. So what not to do. Here's another one of what not to do. When this was constructed back when watershed groups had too much staff and they didn't know what to do with their people. So they had plenty. I believe this group here had like a dozen people working out in the field. So they decided to we're going to do some stream bank stabilization, but we're going to just stabilize everything all the way down. So talk about a use of resource, and imagine once these logs start rotting and falling in, and what happens from that. So another example of what not to do. Now let's look at some valid approaches that work. And starting off with the first category, in-stream cover. Now here's and the techniques you'll see here are all in this publication. And if you're interested afterwards, I can always send you a PDF. We don't have any more printed copies, but we do have the PDF file, which can be freely shared, among groups or interested people. So these are all in the book. No need to worry. So anyways, let's start off with the first one here, half logs or log covers. These are, I'd say, widely used in PEI especially. I've seen quite a few out there. This picture was taken in Trout River. As you can see, the logs are submerged and near the bottom of the brook. And the idea was here to create some cover, because this would be typically used in a stream where you don't have much cover, not much debris providing cover for fish. So they can be fairly easy to install, can either remain there or be temporary. You have to watch out where they're placed, because they can catch debris if they're not placed well. And they can also be damaged by ice if they're set too high. This is just a schematic drawing of that's in our manual that shows how they would typically be installed. Okay, now if we go to artificial undercut banks. Now for most people who go fishing, they may know what is an undercut bank, often where the trout will hang out. But anyways, in a stream where you have no undercuts, in this case you'll see the picture, this was a newly constructed channel. It was pretty much homogeneous, no fish habitat, no cover, as you can see. So in this case the artificial undercuts, or we call them lunkers, were used to create some cover. And these will hide a perfect cover for juvenile and adult fish. They provide lots of cover, and they also can serve to protect the stream bank. But however, they can catch debris and ice, and they may constrict flow and may require some maintenance every few years. Of course, here the drawing of how they're done. All right, another one that's used in larger rivers mostly is rock or boulder groupings. And they're used to provide cover as well, and to break up where currents are pretty much all homogeneous and they're the same. So by creating these little eddies, you create these little microhabitats, and also they can some resting areas can also be created behind the rocks. So yeah, and they do look natural, of course. They increase cover, but they do require heavy machinery in a lot of cases, and it can be a little more costly. And of course, if you add too many of them or they're too large, they can start to disrupt the polar riffle pattern. So they have to have their be well thought out. Another technique for creating cover, root wads. Essentially, this is an uprooted tree, so you have these large trees transported to your site with the the large stem intact. And what you do, you create trenches into the bank, and you insert the trees, but you let the roots stick out into the river. And what this does, of course, it slows down the current and near the stream bank, and creates bank protection, and at the same time it creates some cover in these little microhabitats where fish can hide. These would be very popular spots for trout, especially. But if there's a drawback, it's that also you need heavy machinery to install some of these, and they need to be installed correctly. And here's another drawing as to how they could be installed. Bank stabilization. The root wads were also an example of bank stabilization. But here, if we go into the classical examples, I'm sure you've all seen riprap used along water courses. Of course, riprap really does work well, and it's flexible as a barrier, and it can provide fish cover. And now here's an interesting story. I remember a few years ago starting at DFO, me being the young biologist, and I would often get into arguments with our engineer, Denny Hache, at the time, and he said, well, I can tell you that riprap provides good fish habitat. And I would tell him, no, if there's no shrubs or anything else, it doesn't work. So yes, if we use large angular rocks and we don't use geotextile underneath, well, there's all these little crevices where the fish can hide, and I'm telling you this fish habitat can be created. And he was right, So yeah, they can serve a purpose, and they're often used where there's a high risk for erosion, because it's not in all cases where you could use shrubs or vegetation. When there is a high risk of erosion or infrastructure, or in this case, you have a house right next to the river, it may be wise to use riprap. But once again, it takes machinery to line the stream bank with riprap. And another thing to consider as well is that it will not provide, it will not allow your stream to move laterally, and that's something that that was learned years back, is when in cities especially, where these hard engineered water courses were basically put into a channel, a hardened channel. What would happen often, the channel would erode going downwards, and then what would happen is a lot of these gabions or rocks would fall in. So when you harden your channel, it can come with consequences if it's not done properly. Now, if you look at another form of or another way of using riprap, you could riprap a bank and then have this little edge coming into your water course, which we call a kicker. Of course, this would create some back eddies on the downstream and create some habitat. So this is another variation, and we often saw those in Nova Scotia. One of our former habitat biologists, Charlie McGinnis, he used to use those every now and then. Now, another technique, I believe this is one of my former projects back in the early days, near Bactouche. Yes, in this case, this was adjacent to pasture, where a lot of cows had direct access to the stream, and they would tear up the bank. So I don't know if you'll see my cursor here. So a lot of this was trampled on by the cattle, and was in bad shape. So this was one way to sort of capture and to keep the bank from falling in. So these log riprap, if you want to call them that, do serve their purpose, and they're a lot easier. They're low cost to install. However, they do have a shorter life expectancy, and they require some maintenance every now and then. So it's always the pros and cons of how much does it cost, how easy is it to get in, and how often are you willing to go out there to do maintenance. It's always a balance of those things when you're trying to decide on the technique that you're willing to use. And of course, you can have variations of these. You can have logs filled with rocks in the back, or it could be woody debris. So there's lots of flexibility here. I wish I had a good picture, and I couldn't find one, so I just put up the drawing. Here's one of using riprap, but to have the best of both worlds, what you could do is if you install riprap without geotextile underneath, so you're just laying the riprap on your bank, and allowing some space to plant shrubs or whatnot. It could be willows, it could be other things. So the combination of riprap and vegetation will work together and make for a nice stream bank, and yet at the same time be resistant to erosion. Another obvious one is just but when you have cases where the risk of erosion is not too high, it's just low or to moderate, you could use shrubs. This was a project out in the Potomac area, and these are red osier dogwoods, which tend to develop a nice root system, and they're quite resistant. I've seen some planted in some rivers where a good part of the shrub was torn up by ice scour, but yet they would remain alive and continue growing because they were so resistant. Once the roots take, they hold very well. But as it mentions here, they can take up to 3 years. Yes, they could take just a few years before they start growing and really take up. So you may have to follow up, and you may have to replant a few, or if it's in the summer and it's very dry, you may have to water some of them. But once they take hold, they work fairly well. And of course, they're very good for bank protection, attracting insects and wildlife, whatnot. So next one here, this is where we get really into the stream with some of the, some of the easier techniques. This one's called tree rebatements. Essentially, it's a woody debris barrier that's against the bank to provide it some protection. In this case, in the picture on the left side of the bank, if you look at my cursor, there were some spruce trees that were lined up with stakes planted laterally into the bank. And what it does here, it provides protection against erosion, but at the same time, the spruce trees will capture silt. And as silt deposits into the trees here and along the stream bank, the tree eventually becomes part of the new stream bank, and it becomes very solid. And the thing is, with these, they're very inexpensive. I mean, it's easy to go take out a walk in the woods and find small spruce trees. It's fairly easy to do. It's just a little bit of labor work, but it's very easy to put in and low cost. Here's another drawing just to show the concept, how they're installed. Another one here, techniques that are probably used more in PEI, brush mats. They're essentially little brush bundles that are inserted certain strategic areas, mostly inside the stream beds, to capture silt and to add stability. Of course, they deal with extreme sediment loads at PEI, so they'd be used quite frequently. And it's another technique where they're fairly inexpensive and use local material. But they are labor intensive, and they do have a limited lifespan. Here's another a drawing to show you where they would typically be installed. To go further, we also brush bundles could also be. In literature, you'll find that sometimes you'll look up a technique, and it's actually two techniques. Now, what they call brush bundles in PEI, what I found in the literature, especially in the U.S. and throughout Canada, is that we would often call them fascines, and fascines and brush bundles, as we call them in PEI, are not necessarily the same. Now, the brush bundles that I tend to use, or which the ones we call fascines, are essentially a bundle about. You take a bundle of straight alder cuttings, and you'll bunch them up and maybe into I don't know, a foot-wide bundle, and you'll dig a trench along the stream bank. And what you do is you insert them halfway in the stream bank, and if the cuttings are fresh, what will happen is that some of these branches, the shoots will start to grow. So it does two things. It captures silt that runs off from your stream bank, and it also starts growing and takes up, and so you have some new vegetation growing, and it's also a silt trap. These may require some maintenance as well, and may take time before they're fully stable. If you look at the picture on the right here, this is what you would call a brush mattress. Essentially, you could take branches like from I don't know, it could be from spruce or fir, and you take like the bottom branches, which are usually flat, and you lay them out on eroded soil, and you stake them down, and this will form a barrier against runoff or strong rains, which would encourage erosion. So this is a way of creating a barrier for erosion. And these are just drawings to show more of the technical aspects of how they're installed. I hope you guys are catching this, or at least getting the essential. Don't worry about the fine details. You can always get a copy of this publication later on. Okay, next off, this would be a little fence post. These are similar to the log riprap, which you saw a while ago, except this would be probably a little harder to build. because they would tend to, if you have a river that's severely overwidened, or let's say you just have a section and it's just overwide in that small section, you could sort of cut off, as you'll see here in the drawing. I'm trying to explain it here as best as I can. But you have a section here that's overwide, and what they did is they just chose to close it off here, and you could be, you'd have to find some, make sure that's reinforced in there, and you add a lot of debris or rock, as you can see here, behind this wall here of fence post, and this is a way of sort of filling in that eroded section, if you wish. But it is labor intensive, and of course, if you use a lot of logs, they will require maintenance. If not, they will break up with time. But they do provide excellent bank stabilization if they're constructed right. Well, let's go into the interesting part here. I think a lot of groups probably installed some of these structures before. I'd say the most famous one is probably the digger logs. I know back in the 90s, when I first started with environmental groups, I often heard about digger logs, and they were installed by quite a few groups back then. I think DFO did a great job in selling these. So anyways, if we look at the purpose, really, if you're in a channel where there seems to be a lack of pools or a lack of meandering, let's say, these are the perfect structures. So they'll help you recreate the meandering within your stream, and also create pools where there's a lack of pools. So as the name would imply, they are digger logs. So they do dig. So when they're installed in the right substrate, what they'll do is that they'll dig a pool underneath. So you see the water cascading over the log, as you see here. You can see that the water is coming towards you here this way. So it does cascade over, and when it cascades over, it scours. So all along the log here, they'll get some scouring. So you'll have this pool formed just below the log, just downstream of the log. And from experience, I can tell you, a lot of the nice larger trout tend to hang close to the log where it's deeper. Yeah. Okay, so that's a picture, and this is this is a project, one of the projects that I worked on, and some of my former colleagues here. So as you can see, they're put in sequence. There's one further up here, and there'll be some further up there, and they went up, I think, for a good kilometer or so. But these, of course, they're labor intensive, and they need to be installed right. If they're not installed right, they can become barriers or partial barriers to migration. So they have to be installed the right way. Another one, I'd say this is probably my favorite technique, or the one that I've probably most promoted with groups. It's because they're very easy to install. They're called deflectors, but I'm talking more specifically about tree deflectors, because they're easy to install, and they do work very well. And even if they're not installed exactly like they're supposed to, they probably won't do any harm. So that's why I tend to prefer them. Now, if you look at here, they're the way they work is that they essentially in the inside of a river bend, a meander, you would install them just before the bend, and in this case, this one worked well. This is a tree deflector that was put in here at a 30-degree angle from the bank. So the bank is here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, and the tip of the tree comes out here. And what happens is that by pushing by constricting the flow here, you increase the velocity, and if there's any sediments at the bottom, it's basically going to scour away the sediments. But imagine, so you just flush some of the sediment out for the bottom, so you're exposing clean gravel. But if you put the question you might ask is, okay, well, what happens to those sediments? They're just going to go further downstream and plug something else up. Well, guess what? If you put these in sequence in the right places, if you have a succession of these tree deflectors, flushing the silt from the bottom, and then the silts that are suspended are caught by the next tree deflector downstream during high flows, then as you can see, these act as two things. They do help flush the sediments, and they also act as sediment traps. So if they work well and they're well installed, within a couple of years, this tree is going to be full of sediment, and it all become part of the stream bank. It all form as part of the inside of the meander. They work very, very well if they're installed correctly. And like I said, they're easy to install and they're cheap. Other types of deflectors you'll see in larger rivers, because in larger rivers it's not so easy to install some of these trees. So the best way is to use a crib deflectors. So essentially you create a triangle out of logs and you fill them up with rocks. And these are typically used in larger rivers. But they work on the same principle. What if you ask me, well, Terry, I have this large river, it could be, I don't know, 20 meters across, and I think we need pools and we need to put in a digger log. Well, you're not going to find a tree that long or be able to withstand the flows, and even trying to put it in is going to be problematic. You'll never find a tree large enough unless you found a sequoia spruce that's willing to be shipped from BC. So in this case, it's not logical to use trees in larger river systems. What you would do is you use the same principle, except you would use rocks and put them across the channel at 30 degrees. So as you can see here by the drawing, you put them in at 30 degrees, and on the same principle. Of course, there's a slant to these when you look at the section width here. So I'll show you a picture just to show you what I'm talking about. Here's an example of a rock sill that was installed in Nova Scotia here. Of course, as you can see, these are large rocks, and it requires machinery. So this is much more costly and needs more thorough planning, and to make sure everything is done properly. And if the rocks are set too high, probably in the summer or during low flows, they could become a barrier to fish migration once again. So they need careful planning. Other techniques, we'll see some of the like low head barriers and weirs. We tend to see those, in my experience, more in PEI, where a lot of and the reason I say that is that I noticed that in the 3 maritime provinces, each province is, for some reason, maybe it's the influence from government agencies or certain individuals who tend to prefer certain techniques, but we'll see a variation of these techniques, and in some provinces we'll see more, as in the example of brush mats that you would see more in PEI. But in this case, I'm thinking like the low head barriers, like the one on the right here. You'll see some variation of this, or rocks, where you'll have, let's say a culvert that over time has become perched, or just slightly perched, just enough that some fish can't get through. But by installing a barrier just downstream, some of these like a weir, just downstream of that, could be enough to bring the water level up, and maybe just enough so that the fish can make their way through the culvert. So this is a technique that can be used downstream of a culvert, and which would enhance fish passage. But if they're set too high, they can become a barrier themselves. So once again, it requires careful planning. It may require machinery if used, especially rocks. Removal of obstructions and debris. Well, this is fairly straightforward, the concept, because we're talking about debris. And in this case, you look at artificial debris. I sure hope you don't have sites like this in your watersheds. I thought I'd find a picture here of an extreme example, which I haven't yet seen here in my life. But nonetheless, it just goes to show that when there is a lot of garbage in a stream, it can disrupt hydrology. It definitely cover or smother fish habitat. It'll probably add pollutants as well. So I think a lot of projects, if there's any level of garbage in a stream, sometimes you can go get money and justify cleaning them up. As I said, I hope you don't need to face a situation. Here's one that a situation of woody debris jams, natural woody debris jams, which I've faced many times in many small streams. This is probably one of the most prevalent problems I've seen over the years with groups. Often they would take me out in the field and say, "Hey Terry, look at this stream. It's just loaded with debris everywhere. It's just a giant mess. It's over wide. It's full of woody debris. The water is dirty. There's lots of silt. What do we do?" And I have to tell you that the first few years I would scratch my head and said, "Oh no, what a mess." But I did find I guess an approach, and the approach that seemed to work over the years was that, okay, I would advise the group, okay, well, let's do some what we call selective debris removal. Now you can't, woody debris does play a role in a small stream's ecology, so you cannot remove everything. And then and especially even if it would be helpful to remove all the debris at once, then you'd have this problem of large amounts of sediments making their way through the system. We don't want that. So when I say selective debris removal, typically what you would do is remove, depending on the situation, they would remove especially the debris that would interfere with flow or the hydrology, or which would divert water into a bank and cause other erosional problems. So by carefully removing the proper amount of debris and the right ones, then it would allow the water to once again flow into, somewhat of a channel. And once the silts start to scour over time, typically what groups would do, they go through a selective clearing of some of these debris. And over several months, then a channel will form. And then with the remaining silt that has accumulated, what they would do is install some of these tree deflectors to finally flush out the rest of the silt and to deposit on the banks in that silt. So you'd have 2 steps to this process. When you have a stream that's in this kind of shape, you do selective clearing first, and then the following year you go and install tree deflectors, and then eventually by the 3rd year you may have a cleaner, you have a more defined channel, and you have with a clean bottom and maybe some spawning gravels reappearing. So, but once again, it just takes careful planning. But these, it's all labor work, and but fairly easy to do once it's well planned out. Beaver dams. Oh boy, if there's a controversial one, it's this one. Sometimes I'll have a group sometimes ask me, okay, Terry, should we remove the beaver dam? Well, it's all relative, right? We know the beavers are part of our ecosystems, and they've always been. Now it's a question of, I guess, how many there are. If you tell me, well, we have this stream here is 6 kilometers long, it's got 100 beaver dams on it, then I would probably tell you have a problem. But if you're talking about a dam or 2, then it may not be a problem at all. I mean, I looked in the past at studies. Some scientific studies would suggest that some fish can still make it through dams. So I guess I think the jury's out on this one. It's all relative, like I said. If you have many beaver dams in a watershed, then you may want to have a plan to deal with them and maybe breach some or remove some of them. Now, in this case, if you do determine that that's the approach, you will have to get the proper permits. I know in New Brunswick that Department of Natural Resources do have guidelines for that, so and they do need to get their input. So yeah, it's all relative. These it can be yes or it can be a no when it comes to removing them or dealing with them. So, oh yes, wow, I guess it's the end. I was told to try to do it up in a half hour. I'm a little over, and I'm sorry for that. But it's a lot of material to cover, and I really only gave you a quick summary of these techniques. Really, there is much more to them. But anyways, that's why we have our publication, and there's much more details on the publication if you so wish to have a copy. So anyways, my name is Terry Melanson, and it's my pleasure to have been given the opportunity to talk to you about those techniques once again. It's been my passion for the last 15 years or so, and it's been a great pleasure. So anyways, there you go.
Thank you very much, Terry. That was excellent. Really thorough and very informative. And I'd just like to let folks know that a copy of the guide that Terry has been referring to is available on our website. I can also put a link to it when I post the video from this presentation. There's so much information here that you may want to watch the presentation again. And so just be reminded that the copies of recordings of the presentations are available on our website, on the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation website, as well as on the Canadian Rivers Institute website.